Testing 1, 2, 3. Is it okay here in the sanctuary, here in the chapel? All right, people at home, we are very glad you're with us here at First Presbyterian Church. This is Memorial Day weekend 2022. If anybody is watching this, Kyle, you could leave that door open so we have some ventilation in here. There were people worshiping in here a little while ago, and the coronavirus is up, so we are all being careful, at least some of us are, and we are grateful for your tuning in. If you're watching this live, you can chime in some questions. I will try to keep track of them. I can't usually speak and read at the same time, but I'll try. And those here, please just give a shout out if you have any questions or comments. This can be as interactive as you'd like it. What we've done so far in this little class is we have, inspired by a Presbyterian document called the Confession of 1967 that talks about the reconciliation of the world, that God in Christ is reconciling all things to himself, and therefore those of us in his church are commissioned. Missional is how sometimes people put it. We've got this missional vision of being commissioned to be ambassadors for God's peace. We are agents of reconciliation, compelling others, persuading others, begging others, working for others to be reconciled to God and each other. The way Jesus put it is, blessed are the peacemakers. So we are simply now trying to tell some stories of people that have been peacemakers in our world. A couple of weeks ago, we looked at a Presbyterian guy out in Pittsburgh who organized reconciliation programs between labor and management. The value of the person concept was a guy named Wayne Alderson, and we just documented his story a bit. Last week, we looked at our own Gene Hickman, who was the head of the peacemaking committee for many years here at First Pres. And what we did is we had peacemaking candles originally bought by a babushka, an old woman in Moscow, in a peacemaking trip that our former pastor Blair Money was on. And these candles went out all over. And then Ken Hickman shared, you could go back, it's archived, you can watch it. Ken talked about other things our church has done around peacemaking themes. I gave it a little context by talking about the nuclear freeze campaign, which was big in the 1980s and 90s. And then we talked a little bit, I think the video ran out, but we talked about Peace Child, which was a children's theater piece that had real Russian children and real American children that was sort of a story of peacemaking, almost like Romeo and Juliet, where the ambassador's children realized they could become peacemakers even if their parents had nuclear weapons aimed at each other, and the children are the peace child that begin to end the Cold War. And in that play, which had been done out of England, in the United States, and here in York before, the goal was always to get real American kids and real Russian kids, and the Russians finally let a contingent of Russian kids come over here. They learned the lines, they learned to play. We had a peace camp, taught the kids the chorus, So it was a musical theater piece for children's peacemaking. It played at the United Nations, at the Kennedy Center, but they rehearsed it here in York. And the dress rehearsal, if you will, before they went on tour was at the Strand. And so Bill Shintz, the former photographer and our former neighbor here at First Pres, and Beth and I ate ice cream in his place and cooked this idea up back in the 80s, and it is still in the archives of the Peace Child Foundation, which is out of London. They then later did the thing with children in Palestine and Israel. They tweaked the play a little bit, and it was still a musical. It was still called Peace Child, but they had real Arab Palestinian kids and real Israeli kids. And again, the children in this musical learning to be peacemakers. And so that went on tour for a while, particularly in the Middle East. So we have this little history here of First Pres with our session making statements about peacemaking and sometimes putting ourselves actually behind it. Well, today we're going to talk about a particular peacemaker. And because I want to play a podcast, an interview with a friend of mine who is part of this story, it's going to take some listening. And so I don't want to say too much about the first character because my second character is going to steal the show as he has a podcast. But the first character, the first peacemaker, the first agent of shalom that I want to talk about is Desmond Tutu from South Africa. He won the Nobel Peace Prize. And actually, I don't need to talk about Desmond Tutu too much. Most of you know he was the Archbishop in Cape Town in South Africa in the 70s, an Anglican preacher, a moderate political voice against some of the extremes on both sides in South Africa. By the way, his wife was very good friends with the Episcopal bishop's wife in Harrisburg. And so every now and then they would come and worship at the Episcopal Cathedral in Harrisburg, and nobody knew because they were just there visiting as friends. And so some parishioners there at the Episcopal Church in Harrisburg would look over and see Desmond Tutu and his wife there worshiping with them there in central Pennsylvania. How about that? What I really want to talk about is, besides Desmond Tutu's visionary, caring, peacemaking ministry, and what a happy, funny guy he was. Everybody, by all accounts, said he was full of whimsy and joy. What I really want to talk about, however, is one thing he did. He was the chairman of something, and it's not really his doing, but he chaired what's called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And as we looked at our Confession of 67 about being peacemakers in the Presbyterian Church, that God calls us to be peacemakers, we noted that that confession, and Stephanie and Allison, when they talked about it, explained this, was more than just people being nice or interpersonal peacemaking, but it also includes structures and systems and even social and political implications of our peacemaking. So by highlighting this morning the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we're going to show sort of a structural side or an institutional side to peacemaking, although granted there were many great heroic people like Desmond Tutu behind it. He was the chair. What is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you might ask? Well, as you probably know, there was this just awful, evil system of apartheid. Some people with South African accents say apartheid. Apartheid, a separate legal division between the blacks and the whites and the coloreds, as they called them, and the Indians, as they called them. Gandhi lived there for a little while, and there were Indians in South Africa. That these different races were legally separated and incredibly repressed if you were of a person of color. About land holdings, about needing to have passes to travel, about who you could marry, about your tribal language, about the schools. It was the worst sort of repression of the caliber of Stalinist Russia. The fear that people of color lived with in South Africa, and the repression and the poverty, is just legendary in the 20th century. Particularly got ugly in the early 1900s with a Land Act, which took millions and millions of people away from their land. Almost you could think of sort of the way in which there was genocide with Native Americans, and the way we took land and the colonizers just messed everything up in the United States often. It was sort of like that. a little history of South Africa just so we can get to the Peace and Reconciliation Commission, which after apartheid ended was a reconciliation of people telling stories of the awful torture and repression. And to be honest, have reconciliation after the truth was told. And so there was this published commission where people would lament or confess, maybe with regret or maybe not, and possibly get amnesty for their crimes if they had tortured people and so forth. And so this commission that analyzed that thing, to understand the power of it, we have to know a little bit about the history of apartheid. Early 1900s, it was awful. By the middle of the 20th century, 1950, 1946, South Africa formed a new country between the British and the Dutch. It was colonized by the Dutch in the 1600s, so we could say there's hundreds, even centuries of years of problems here. You've heard of the Cape of Good Horn, you know, down in the Cape Town area. That was Dutch. But then the British took over. There was something called the Boer, B-O-E-R, the Boer, B-O-E-R, the Boer War, which was the Dutch versus the English of who was going to run, these minority white folks going to run the majority black South Africa. By the time the British won, it became a colonial power of England, but the Dutch still swayed almost everything there and took into power. And by 48, when they became a new country, they passed laws that were officially apartheid. So apartheid began officially in about 1946 and got really bad in 1950. In the 50s, anybody that was African, black-skinned had to have passes to travel and so forth, worse than even the Palestinians now, where they can't even go to the doctor in their own hometown without the right kind of pass. The repression was brutal, and many black South Africans, 90% black, about 10% white, that's real rough figures, but 10% of the people that were white owned almost everything and had all the power, and black majorities were repressed with these pass laws and so forth, where they could live. They were forced into townships, I think in many ways analogous to what we might call reservations back in the Trail of Tears with the Cherokees and so forth. They were forced to live in townships, separated husbands and wives, so they could work in mines and so forth. It's a very mineral-rich country. They called them homelands, where they had to live. They had to go back. About 4 million people were displaced from their home in these townships. And in the 50s, there began a movement where African-American people, or African people, black South Africans, would say, we're not going to carry these passes. Nelson Mandela is a name you probably know, who burned his pass in the 50s and was arrested and put in jail. Black organizations began to resist. At first, non-violently. There was something called the ANC, and the ANC was at first committed to non-violence, kind of like Martin Luther King. As I mentioned, Gandhi lived there at the time. And so this non-violent resistance became illegal, and they outlawed any meetings of these organizations. So if you went to a meeting, you could be arrested. If you signed a pledge, you could be arrested. You can imagine the secret paramilitary police, the arrests without due process, the torture that began. As the resistance moved more vocal, the government increased the police to paramilitary police and to army, and they began massacres. The Sharpeville massacre was one of the worst, shot into a crowd. That would have been 65. Years later, jump ahead, when Nelson Mandela was finally released from prison and this whole evil house of cards collapsed and they had a new constitution, Nelson Mandela signed the new constitution back at Sharpeville, this town where one of the first major massacres happened in 65. And so these ongoing resistance made the resistors that were protesting illegal, and then they could arrest people at will. They would conscript young men, of course. Part of this, the context is the Cold War, and of course they're concerned about communism, because communism was infiltrating many countries in Africa and Central America. I mean, it's just true, they were there. The ANC had connections with the Communist Party, and they began to become violent as an armed rebellion, as an armed resistance, what we would call, on this Memorial Day, a revolutionary war. People in their own country took up arms so that their own children wouldn't be attacked and killed with death squads and tortured and so forth. So they had 400 years of colonialism of the British and the Dutch. Then they had about 100 years of terrible repression, and then about 50 years of legal apartheid. And the legal apartheid is what many of us, came to hear about in the 1980s. That's when it began to be, because in part of Desmond Tutu's voice and Nelson Mandela in jail for so many years, other Presbyterians like Alan Bozak, a Methodist, Frank Chicane, many church leaders through the World Council of Churches and through our own Presbyterian denomination started a movement where churches would try to get their boards that they own money in to divest from South Africa. And there was a huge divestment movement where corporations, kind of like we're doing with the Ukraine now, where they would say we have to stop doing business with South Africa. Just a little side note, some of you remember or may know Paul Simon from Simon and Garfunkel. Paul Simon recorded the album Graceland using South African musicians, violating a boycott of South African musicians, and he took a lot of heat for that, but he wanted to use South African musicians and have a South African flavor to the album, and so he was under a lot of heat for breaking this boycott of South African artists. No artists, Michael Jackson or anybody, would perform there. And so all the pressure of the world was trying to stop apartheid, as the people themselves there, either non-violently or violently, with or without communist influence, all began to try to bring down the apartheid government. It got worse. There was torture, as I've said, and so forth. Well, look, we could talk more about that if we need to, but it gives you the picture of the horror and the violence and the trauma of those years as the 70s and 80s resistance increased. The divestments began to work. The protests were winning. A Dutch, brutal prime minister who had originally connections with the Nazis had left, and a new guy, that was Botha, a new guy named de Klerk came to power, and everybody thought he would continue to enforce white supremacy there. And somehow, we don't exactly know why, he had a change of heart, and they declared apartheid illegal in the early 1990s, let Nelson Mandela out of jail, and started a new constitution. That's the really, really rough and ready, quick version. But here's then what happened next, and that was all background of this quick thing we need to say for today. Our profile in peacemaking is this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, chaired by Desmond Tutu. They concluded that the best thing to do moving forward would to be create space, thousands of hearings where people who had done wrong, shot into crowds, arrested people illegally, judges that just looked the other way, cops that killed people innocently, torturers, paramilitary police people, lynchings, the kind of thing we think of, the trauma of the Deep South, where there's lynchings and stuff, where they begin to name those things. And so they had 3 parts of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, 3 committees, if you will. And one committee was about reparations and repair, to sort of figure out how you can help the people that have been harmed. Another one was the actual hearing of testimonies where people sort of confessed. They did not demand regret or remorse, but they invited people to tell the story so they could name it. I forget what the third committee was called. I had it written down here, and somehow I'm not seeing it. I wrote it down here. What are the 3? Oh, one was called the Human Rights Violation Commission, and that's the one that actually documented the human rights violations. The Reparation and Repair Commission offered reconciliation possibilities, rehab, reparations, what do you do with the victims? And then the Amnesty Committee, where a decision would be made if a person who confessed their sins could be given legal amnesty, where they would not be prosecuted for the death squads and the tortures and so forth. Not everyone who confessed actually received amnesty. I am told that there were over 8,000 people who confessed to certain crimes who did not get amnesty. There were roughly 1,000 who did. It was a little less than 1,000, I think, and 900 some that got amnesty because they showed remorse and so forth. So there was this public space, first at Cape Town, held at a university, also at Rhema Bible Church in another city, and also at another big public meeting hall in yet another city, Johannesburg, I think Cape Town. And they had these hearings. When they first began, they were live televised, and it was just riveting across the country. It was so traumatic to hear for, say, parents of a youth who had been tortured to death, to hear the description of that on live television, that they finally quit doing it live. It was remarkably powerful, I'm told, by people that live there on all sides. And we might say, too, that those in the ANC that were part of the armed struggle, they were doing some pretty heinous things, too. And so they, too, it wasn't all just sort of white torturers that were needing to confess. There were armed rebels that, out of a just cause, still did awful atrocities. So both sides were confessing to atrocities and seeking amnesty. The main thing Tutu would say is that whether you get legal amnesty or not, we can never move on towards reconciliation until truth is told. We can never have healing until we kind of get the diagnosis. So we need to name and explain and say what we have done. That resonates with the Christian theology of confession. We don't earn God's forgiveness by going through the hoops. Kyle often says this in our own prayer of confession. This isn't like a transaction. We say the right prayer of confession and then God shows up to forgive us. It's not that quid pro quo. That's not gospel. But still, nonetheless, we have to name and be honest about who we are and what's going on, and that's what they felt they had to do in South Africa, so they could develop a theology of reconciliation. They hired a theologian, Desmond Tutu, to lead the country in a public theological process that lasted years, naming things like reconciliation, forgiveness. Kyle.
You might have to repeat it because I'm not sure.
Oh, yeah.
But the Racial Justice Task Force, that's a lot of what they're trying to work on with this faith celebration, is to name not only the joys, but name the deep sorrow.
That's exactly, to repeat what Kyle said, our own church is dealing with in our Racial Justice Task Force. Some know, and we'll hear more about this in weeks to come, that our own church is a merger of a primarily white, rich church and a primarily African-American, black Presbyterian church. And years and years ago, at the suggestion of Martin Luther King, by the way, the two churches merged, and there's conversation around that. And our commission now is still 50 years on, trying to figure out to name the joys but also the sorrows of that. And some of the sorrows were swept under the rug because we wanted to honor the neat public witness it was. And Desmond Tutu's Truth and Reconciliation Committee had that struggle that we ourselves are learning from in our own committee here at our church, of how do you name the injustices and the sorrows and grieve and lament and celebrate and see the moving forward what God's Spirit could do. So Desmond Tutu, as a public theologian and as a pastor and as an Anglican bishop, archbishop, led this commission where they had this process of talking about reconciliation. Eventually they had it on live TV like for an hour a week, and it was on live radio. And there are, I think, about 1,000 public hearings over a period of about 3 years. Not everybody felt it went well. Some people no, there needs to be justice before there can be mercy. For instance, some of you may know the name Steve Biko, who was one of the African leaders of the resistance who was put in jail like Nelson Mandela, but was tortured to death and killed. Acquaintance of mine knew the last journalist that saw him was an American guy, and they've made movies about that, like the Cry Africa or Cry Freedom movie that Attenberg made is about Steve Biko. Biko's family sued the Truth and Reconciliation Commission because they said, we do not want amnesty for our killers. We want justice under the law. When we figure out who killed Biko, the prison guards that tortured him and killed him, we want them brought to justice. So if they say what they did, that's all well and good, but we want justice, not mercy. And understandably so. There was conflict and debate about this. But then that amped up the conversation about what does forgiveness mean, and what does justice mean, and what does mercy mean. They used a model, a phrase, that interestingly I think was first coined by a scholar that worked for Chuck Colson, called restorative justice. It's sort of a thing in criminology these days over the last 30, 40 years, where instead of retributive justice, where you give retribution, justice can be restoring as it was in the Bible. If you hurt somebody, you didn't fundamentally hurt the state or the law, you hurt a person. So you have to make it right. Not just do time because you affected the government and you have to pay a price by going to jail, but you hurt an individual or a family and you got to be reconciled to them. And so in the Bible, there's this restoration motif rather than just punishment motif. And so a criminology of restorative justice is what guided the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now you see, this gets complicated. We've told nice stories heretofore of lighting peace candles and praying for peace and marching for peace and having peace child plays. And it's very exciting and it's all very good. But this is the week we just want to admit that peacemaking can be messy, it can be painful, it can be complicated, and it can be even traumatizing. These commissions went on and on. Horrible, unspeakable things were said. And what I'd like to do now is I'm going to set up a podcast we're going to listen to for about 15 minutes by a Dutch, an Afrikaan. Afrikaan is the name of Dutch white folks in South Africa, Boers, B-O-E-R. They are often called Afrikaans, 2 A's in the end, and they speak Afrikaner. It's a Dutch sort of South African language. My friend Gideon Strauss is a white Afrikaan, a white South African. He now lives in Canada and teaches at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto. Gideon is a dear friend. Came to faith dramatically in the 70s. Was a pacifist and a peacemaker for a while. He studied Ron Sider and people, John Howard Yoder and others that were writing about peacemaking in those years. He eventually shifted from that, but in his story, Gideon would say that there came a time of conscience for him because of the conscription. Every young white male had to serve in the army, and by that point, the army had become like a paramilitary police that would go into protests and shoot people. You would be shooting your fellow citizens. It wasn't to like fight a war for your protection of your country, although that's how they viewed it, protecting your country from the blacks and the reds, from the communists and the blacks. And so he had to be a conscientious objector, which was permitted, interestingly enough, if you were religiously motivated. So Gideon became a conscientious objector in the middle of those years because he said, I can't kill my black fellow citizens and brothers and sisters because they want justice and civil rights. That is to say that Gideon then got a job, get this, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He worked under Desmond Tutu and under others. There were probably, I forget, I think it was like 800 staff that were doing all this, funded in part by other countries. Norway helped fund it, interestingly enough. God bless Norway. Funded these hearings and these recordings. And Gideon was a translator. So when the Dutch guys who had committed atrocities would tell their story, with or without remorse, they would tell their story, often in gruesome detail, he would translate it into English, because he knew both Dutch and English. Gideon once told me, and it was one of the most shocking, memorable conversations I've ever had in my entire life, that he told me once when he was doing that, he was beginning to listen to the torturer talk about abducting a person, a black person, and trying to convince him to tell the details of where the armed resistance was going to be and all this stuff. And they tortured him brutally. And partway through, Gideon realized he was talking about a friend of his, a black friend of his from 10 years ago, that he was narrating the story of the torturer of one of his own dear friends. So this is what it means to be a peacemaker sometimes. There is a price to be paid, and it can be hard. What we're going to do is we're going to ask Amanda to click this podcast on in just about a minute here, but I'm just going to say 3 quick things. Gideon in the beginning, he has a bit of an accent, so listen carefully. Gideon talks about tertiary trauma. I just wanted you to hear that phrase. Primary trauma, the victims who were tortured. Secondary trauma, the torturers. People that do torture are themselves traumatized. It's evil stuff that wears away at your humanity. And then he, as a translator, and many of the people in the Truth and Reconciliation, paid a price documenting all this stuff. So he says, I had tertiary trauma. I just wanted you to hear that phrase. He later calls the work valiant, That's a great word, valiant. At one point, he talks about rebuilding the country. He uses the phrase Niberian. I just want to say what that means. There was a realist theologian named Reinhold Niebuhr, who was kind of a Christian realist. He said, in a sinful, fallen world, you got to work with power, and it's not real dramatic like Martin Luther King. It's just the slow work. And he said, I was Niberian at one point. That's all that means. And then he says, get this, near the end, that his Reformed Calvinist faith is dispositional, not just doctrinal. In other words, he didn't read in the Bible the doctrines of grace, systemize it, and then say, okay, that's what I'm supposed to believe. He said, I felt it in my bones that God gave us this gift. And then I realized, oh, Calvin kind of said that, and so I guess that's a way to say it. So his faith and his Reformed faith, his Presbyterian faith, is more dispositional, how he feels, than what he necessarily believes in his abstract thinking. Is that interesting? So those are just some things to listen for as we hear Gideon, who worked for the Peace and Justice Reconciliation Commission in South Africa in the 1990s. I hope we can hear this.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my goodness. Well, we can talk about that forever. So I think apartheid in itself, against the bigger backdrop of racism and colonialism, created a field of terror for all South Africans that resulted in the experience of trauma on a national level. And so that experience of trauma, which I think persisted throughout the whole era of colonization, and there's much more to be said about that, intensified as the struggle between the apartheid government and forces of liberation intensified in the 1980s, so that I think the experience of trauma expanded from the experience of only the directly oppressed to also become the experience of the oppressor in that setting, and specifically the experience of, specifically but not exclusively, the experience of men who were conscripted into military service to defend and uphold the apartheid order. Now, while I was able to refuse to serve in the military, the vast majority of my age either did not want to or did not have the means to escape the experience of serving in the military in South Africa. And I would say for all of them, that was an experience of trauma, sometimes an experience of suppressed trauma when they were able to live within the purview of a cultural myth in which they could see themselves as warriors or defenders or soldiers of, defending some good. There's much to be said about that. But if the myths were already fragile for them, which was the case for, I think, the majority of men, it was a nihilistic experience. It was a meaningless experience in which they felt they fought to uphold an order in which they no longer really could believe. And then when that order was negotiated away, and as some people would say, who did military service, it was negotiated out from under their feet. So then they found themselves in the early 90s in a situation where they had seen their comrades die, and they themselves killed other people in service of something which they then discovered those who sent them to war already did not believe in by the time that they were sent to war, right? So that's an extremely traumatizing experience. You killed people in service of something that the people who made you do the killing no longer believed in. And so the consequences, which is narrated by many people of my age in short stories or essays or novels or movies, was one of profound trauma and psychological disturbance, which in my peer group resulted in, among other things, a fairly large percentage of people committing suicide. Now, here I am. I did not commit suicide. I did not kill anybody. I did not see people die next to me. what I did do was work for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa in 1996 and 1997 as an interpreter. And the majority of the testimony that I interpreted was the testimony of perpetrators who did serve the South African state either as police officers or soldiers. And so I gave them words, or rather they would speak in one language, usually Afrikaans. I would interpret that into English. And so first person testimony for 2 years of people telling about how they abducted people, how they tortured people, and how they murdered people.
Mm-hmm.
And so while acknowledging that my own trauma is sort of tertiary trauma, you know, if the perpetrator's trauma is secondary and the victim's trauma is primary, then as an interpreter, my trauma is tertiary trauma. While acknowledging that my own trauma is tertiary trauma, nonetheless, I experienced it as a profoundly traumatizing set of events, the 2 years of interpreting. And so coming to terms with that has been a lifelong process. It's not, you know, people ask me, so how did you get over that? I don't think either the primary or the secondary or the tertiary trauma in that setting is something you get over, but I think it's something that you either come to hold or fail to hold in a variety of ways that allow you to function.
If you look at that in a larger context and say like a nation, where a nation has to hold trauma such as apartheid, are there any ways in which you think a nation could work to hold themselves together after that, as opposed to ways in which that they might crack and fall apart because of the trauma in the past?
Yeah. My short answer is I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Slightly longer answer is time will tell. But I would say that South Africa is an experiment in exactly that. Contemporary South Africa is an experiment in that. We are 25 years into a post-apartheid regime that followed roughly 50 years of apartheid, that followed roughly 400 years of colonialism, 500 years actually of colonialism. And so, so it remains to be seen. I think South Africa made a valiant effort through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which did work from roughly 96 to roughly 2000, so about a 5-year period. I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was as valiant an effort as I know of. I think South Africa was lucky in having as the chair of the commission Archbishop Desmond Tutu, or then Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu, fondly known as the Arch for Archbishop by South Africans, who theologized that experience as a Christian for the nation. While the legislation for the commission was not Christian legislation, South Africa is a country that chose in its new constitution to think of itself as related to a God or God. It's a country that allowed the Archbishop to theologize the commission in ways of dying to self for the sake of the other, of forgiveness, of remorse, even though the commission did not require remorse from people who gave testimony. But the Archbishop helped the country to live through a story in the late 90s in which the country said to itself, we will face up to the truth of what happened specifically between 1960 and 1993, a period of overt armed struggle over apartheid. And by coming to terms with those truths, we will accomplish a degree of reconciliation. I think if you were to talk to a 20-year-old South African now, the vast majority of 20-year-old South Africans now would say that that effort had failed. I would disagree with them. I would say that that effort had succeeded as much as such an effort can succeed in the world as broken as it is. and that the fact that South Africa for 25 years has successfully built a constitutional democratic political order in which we, as a nation, agree to be governed, the vast majority of South Africans, by our actions, agree to be governed by a specific constitution that allows us to co-determine our future democratically by means of partisan engagement in a proportional representative democracy, and to dialogically engage one another around what future we want. The fact that we've achieved that, the fact that the vast majority of violence in South Africa now is criminal violence rather than political violence, and that the political violence that does occur is micro-political, and it's factional within parties. It's not violence with the intention of overthrowing the constitutional order. I would say that that constitutes a success, actually, for that process. And that now it's to be Weberian about it, Max Weber, now it's the slow boring of hard boards. It's a very slow process of enculturating a political order of, as a sort of a Whig Caperian, a kind of a neo-progressive, would say that the slow task of incrementally improving things is now the project, and that what that means is that the country won't get over the trauma. The trauma will perdure for generations and probably centuries, and it will take all kinds of efforts to deal with that in individual and communal lives and on the national level. Similar to the experience of slavery in the United States. The United States will never get over slavery, but it should and can address that national trauma also politically.
Was it hard to hold your faith at the same time as seeing the destruction of people's lives and of themselves?
Okay, so weirdly, no. So I'm a dispositional or emotional Calvinist. What I mean by that is that I feel myself held by the grace of God. There's not an intellectual conviction, it's not a dogmatic statement, so although, yeah, it's a dogmatic statement for me, but my Calvinism is more dispositional than what it is doctrinal. I feel myself, and I felt myself also through that whole time, held by the grace of God. My spirituality is very much a spirituality worked out within the gymnasium of the Psalms. And that's true for me since the early 90s. So not from my conversion, but from the early 90s, very consciously and intentionally, my spirituality is a spirituality that's shaped within that, as Ambrose of Milan said, the gymnasium of the Psalms. During the 2 years that I worked with the commission, the most difficult part of my spirituality was dealing with this trauma and dealing with these realities. And so my spirituality, I would say, shrunk down to a psalm like Psalm 137, which is a cry of the oppressed, which is not my cry, but in solidarity with the oppressed, a cry for God to punish the evildoers, and to punish them by bringing their line to an end, in a sense. So the psalm itself asks God to send somebody who will take the Babylonians' babies and crash their skulls against the rocks, right? Which is a very intense and extreme statement of asking God to make this stop, bring this culture to an end, bring this civilization to an end, bring this oppression to an end, liberate us by killing our oppressors and their progeny. And for me, emotionally, that was the cry, bring this system to an end, bring the effects of this system to a decisive end by whatever means possible. So emotionally, that was my spirituality. I worked with the commission in 96 and 97. But it was not a cry directed away from God. That was a dialogue with God. Right? So from a position of trusting that in the midst of all of this disaster and horror, God somehow is at work. And that's appropriate for me to tell God exactly how I feel about the situation in whatever extreme terms I needed to. And I mean, Bruce Coburn's, song, I wish I had a rocket launcher. If I had a rocket launcher, it would be very similar to Psalm 137. And I sang that song as I drove from hearings. I played it in my little cassette tape deck in my car, along with early songs by U2 that had similar sentiment. What happened for me, though, was there was a specific event. So I was interpreting the testimony of a police officer, and it was an in-camera hearing, so it wasn't public and it's not recorded. And as I was interpreting this police officer's testimony, he was describing how he was torturing someone, but the details of the person that he was torturing allowed me to realize that he was talking about torturing one of my actual friends. So it was an event that had taken place 10 years earlier in the 1980s. It's one of my black friends from that time. And so peculiarly it turned out that, wow, I'm giving words to this guy as he's talking in great and horrifying detail how he tortured my friend. And I thought to myself, if I had a handgun now, I would want to walk out of this interpreter's booth and I would want to shoot this guy dead because of my love for my friend, right? Same hearing, the commissioners asked this police officer why he did what he did, and he gave a really powerful account, arguing that he did what he did for love's sake. And so he said, roughly in words that amounted to, I love my wife, I love my children, I love my neighbors, I love my folk, my people, my ethnic community, I love my race, I love my country. And because of these loves, I felt duty-bound as a police officer to defend the things that I love against the rooi gevaar, the red threat, and in die swart gevaar, the black threat. And so I had to defend against black people and against communism the things that I loved. And as he gave that testimony, I realized that emotionally, that was the same set of feelings that I was feeling in relation to my friend. That for the sake of the love of my friend, I was perfectly happy to kill this person. And for the sake of the love of his friends, so to speak, he was perfectly happy to torture and murder people. And for me, that allowed a kind of a shift in my spirituality towards Psalm 51, which is the psalm of, I did these terrible things, or I'm willing to do these terrible things. I'm willing to murder people for the sake of what I love. So Psalm 51 is David. He fell in love with the woman next door, and for the sake of that love, was happy to murder her husband or have him murdered. And I think, in that moment or in that time, a sort of an Augustinian understanding of evil became my understanding of evil as misguided love. And so for me, that became both a way of understanding my own evil and the structural evil in which I found myself as expressions of misguided loves, or in Bob Goudsworth's terms, idolatries. In that context, therefore, rather than diminishing my relationship with Jesus or my understanding of my relationship with God, it intensified that relationship as a kind of like a last harbor or an anchor. And also, the anchor in Christian theology is a symbol of hope. So as a source of hope also for transformation and change, both for me personally and for the country I was in. So, and I'm not, this is not a statement of virtue. Again, dispositionally Calvinist, it feels like an experience of rescue, that my continuing assurance of the love of God, both for the world and for me as an individual, is not something that I generate, it's something that I receive. And I'm saying that emotionally rather than doctrinally, even though I doctrinalize my emotions.
Gideon, thanks for joining us.
Well, if this is still on, I'll just say this in closing. As we said earlier, Peacemaking is a call in a fallen world. It is a transformative call, but there is sometimes a price to be paid. And just hearing the anguish in Gideon's voice as he narrates abuse in South Africa for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and he says he'll never get over that. He wondered if America will ever get over slavery. We can and should move forward and name the trauma and deal with it, but some of these things are going to take generations to heal. And so this is the step-by-step public theology and public service that can create institutions where reconciliation can at least be named. In another interview, Gideon said something similar too, that even though it didn't work in the simple sense that everybody went home loving each other, but to name sin, to offer forgiveness, to enter into the public discourse language of reconciliation, as they did there for decades in South Africa, to talk about truth and reconciliation, it is fascinating that that same idea is now happening all over the world. There are dozens of these truth and reconciliation committees in Central America where there were similar tortures, in several African countries, and even in a few cities in the United States where there were civil rights abuses, like in Greensboro. They are now trying to name the people that did the lynching, invite them to come forward, offer some sort of amnesty or forgiveness, sort of a reconciliation that's based on truth-telling and not sweeping things under the rug. And so from our little race committee here that grapples with those questions to these other countries that are even doing it now, this Desmond Tutu Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we thought was a good thing to hold up as one profile of peacemakers in the world. So those at home, thank you for your comments. Those that are here, thank you for being with us. We'll look at another topic next week, another profile of someone who has been an agent of reconciliation. Why don't we close on a quick prayer? God, we do thank you that we can be dispositionally, we can feel in our hearts your love and your rescue. I thank you for Gideon and his words to us on this podcast. I thank you for Desmond Tutu and other leaders who raised such powerful witness in South Africa for peace and justice, for shalom and goodness, and for truth and reconciliation. Allow us to figure out, Lord, what it means in our time and place to be these kind of people that serve you in this kind of way. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.